Now we have a few moments to continue the conversation in a more informal fashion, and I was hoping that I could persuade my panelists to engage with some of the emerging questions from this heartbreaking witness, particularly going back to the very question of the panel. What is the impact of war on religious freedom, but also what might be the impact of religious freedom on war? What difference is it going to make, whether we're talking again about conventional war or cultural wars, whether religious freedom thrives or whether it's curbed for various strategic reasons. As we all know, war is often about ethnic cleansing, about clearing the fields and creating safe haven for particular ideologies, which also means removing those who in some way do not fit into the caliber of those particular ideologies. So how do we bring religious freedom into the equation in this situation? And what difference is it likely to make on the ground? So, shall we have the first round of reflections on that?
Well, I think it is obvious to say that war is one of the great enemies of religious freedom, but I think it is equally obvious to say that religious freedom is one of the great antidotes to war. Pope Paul VI, who, by the way, is going to be canonized this October, used to say that to end war, work for justice. Well, it is quite clear that an application of that principle today would be to end war, work for religious freedom. Let's take a situation like Iraq, where I just returned from there. It is stunningly obvious to anyone on the ground in Iraq today that there really are only two long-term trajectories for that country's future. Okay, one is a continued slide into ethnic and religious tensions in which it is turned into one of the world's largest living Christian free zones. The numbers of Christians in Iraq prior to the first U.S. invasion in 1993 were estimated to be over 2 million when we went back in 2003. Or 91, sorry. When we went back in 2003, it was estimated to be 1.5 million. Today, the high-end estimate, the robust estimate you will get from officialdom in the church is 350,000. Realistically, most people who are on the ground think it's closer to around 200,000. So, this is a short-term slide into extinction. And that's true not just of the Christians, obviously, but of the Yazidi minority as well. And so one trajectory is a kind of minority-free zone in which what you have is, therefore, a war of all against all between Sunnis and Shias for ultimate control of the prize. In such a scenario, we're talking about an Iraq that is increasingly radicalized, an Iraq that is increasingly militarized, that is destabilizing, and that will be a long-term sort of geopolitical headache for the foreseeable future. The other option is that Iraq finds a way forward to become a constitution-based society in which minorities, the rights of minorities, are not only recognized on paper but protected in practice, in which Christians will have an opportunity, Christians and others will have an opportunity to make their contributions. That is very much the dream for which young Christian Iraqis today are fighting. If you ask them how confident it is, how they are, that they will live to see that dream, they will all express fairly deep skepticism about it, frankly. But nevertheless, many of them are willing to invest their lives in trying to achieve it. Look, this is why when Secretary Brownback said earlier that we need to engage the security people on this, this is, since I began reporting on anti-Christian persecution around the world decade and a half ago, It has been stunning to me how this never seems to come up in national security conversations, because it is abundantly clear that the United States has a strategic interest in Iraq. I would think our 2 incursions would have demonstrated that. It is a pivotal part of the world. We have a vital interest in which way that society goes, and religious freedom is a core, perhaps the core. You're never going to understand a society like Iraq if you look at it just through geopolitics and military and economic and security considerations, because religion is the beating heart of that society and always has been. So it would seem to me that if we are concerned with conflict resolution in the early 21st century, how you can possibly have that conversation without considering the religious freedom dimension of it is just, to me, unthinkable.
And one of the things which seems to emerge in Middle Eastern context, particularly experts who work on Syria and Iraq, is that they're adamant that looking into conflict resolution through the lens of human rights and religious freedom in particular is far more effective than focusing on religion and the demographics of religion, simply because they reflect that religion is a divisive aspect in the Middle Eastern societies. And this is why actually finding reconciliation through the lens of human rights and religious freedom as well is more likely to work rather than focusing on religion, which could potentially be seen as a threat on the ground. Which brings me to a question which I wanted to raise with Christina, perhaps, which is religion and religious freedom in particular clashing with issues of national security concern, particularly in places like Russia. In Russia, there is a particular concept in several of their national security doctrines, which were adopted by successive presidents, that there is something like religious beliefs which are considered as a threat to national security, that religious plurality in some way could be seen as undermining the traditional values and the traditional religious ideas of Russia's society. And this is certainly emerging in other contexts beyond Russia. So how could we really push this agenda out of the equation, out of the debate, and really make a stronger case that religious freedom is more likely to be the paradigm shift where we could find a more common denominator?
Thank you. Yes, Russia is having a particular difficulty dealing with the idea that people should have a conscience that's independent from the state. And this is a situation that oftentimes is used as an excuse to say, well, it's a matter of national security to make sure we get rid of extremist groups. So the Russian government in particular has come up with how to identify an extremist group. The first way to identify an extremist group is a group that promises salvation. Well, I don't know about any religion that doesn't. So, of course, this is an issue. Second, issues having to do with money, financing from another state. And the list goes on and on. And the two groups that have been particularly targeted in the recent past have been the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Scientologists. These two groups have been identified extremist groups. Many of their publications are now categorized as extremist publications. By the way, for those of you who have studied Hinduism, all Hindu texts in Russia at one point 2 years ago were considered extreme texts. And the Jehovah's Witnesses have now become entirely illegal in Russia. And so have the Scientologists. They have been, many of them are now suffering arrest. They have tried to flee the country. I think a bigger philosophical issue about this is the fact that since time immemorial, there have been excuses for us to hate the other, to make sure that the other didn't come a part of our community. And these new trends to make it more palatable for us to accept that the other doesn't deserve the same rights that we do has become rather sophisticated. I was very moved by all the stories you told about Myanmar. I was there last year. It's a very complex and terrible situation. And of course, I was very moved by the stories you told as well. But I think it would be an injustice for me not to say the following. We are not a perfect country at all. But I'm a refugee in this country. My parents escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba. My mother was in a concentration camp in Germany. And we are still the freest country in the world. We have poured trillions of dollars in assistance into all the countries that have been mentioned. All of the difficulties that were mentioned earlier did not happen because America trained people or gave them weapons. It happened because it is human nature that people are going to fight over ethnicity and race and religious belief. So it would be a great disservice to blame one particular country as the instigator or the provider of weaponry or tools for these issues. We are in this together. We didn't make it happen. We have been trying to assist imperfectly, granted. But the United States government, for all of its faults, is the only country that has hosted a minister-level conference just to speak about how we can assist other countries to improve their situation having to do with religious freedom. And it has invited faith-based organizations from all over the world to apply for USAID grants that are funded by American taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. There is something I wanted to turn the conversation towards with Steve, particularly in the context of humanitarian relief. There is this sense that while the stage of humanitarian relief is associated with the idea that help is there, and we are to improve the conditions of people who have lost their homes, who are on the run, and yet there appear to be reports that very often in refugee camps there is a segregation of refugees, and this segregation is often on the basis of religion or belief, that Christians are not welcome in camps dominated by Sunni refugees. Very often, as a result of that, Christian churches set up their own operations and create their own comfort zone. And I was just wondering whether you could reflect more on these emerging trends and whether religious freedom as an opportunity to create a melting pot and an understanding that we are all together in this and we have to find a way out of it, and the reconciliation in crisis is a very important part of it, is emerging through your work.
Where I've experienced this firsthand is with the Rohingya, and they are largely nominal Muslims who don't identify with either sect, either major sect, and who view Christianity as a threat to their culture and their future, and who have historically treated converts to Christianity with terrible unkindness, and who also would not be open to the idea of Christian churches or Christian worship happening. Through the conflict since 2012, however, I've seen a softening of that, and we have been clear with the Rohingya that from the beginning that we're Christians, that we come to serve and love without the motive of converting them. And having done that, they welcome us and have treated us as friends, even when missionaries were largely kicked out of one of those cities, Sittwe, in 2013. So I have seen and experienced what you're talking about, Dr. Petkoff. Also, a little bit in Syria. The Sunni and the Shia refugees are definitely not in the same camps, at least the ones that I have visited. And even last week, I was with a group of Christians, and we talked to one of the ministers in their parliament who invited us to help rebuild with development projects and infrastructure what he called the pluralistic society that he had been a part of. I asked him what sect he belonged to, and he said, well, I don't actually think about that, and most of my friends don't either. This is just what he said. He said that whether you're Shia or Sunni or Christian or Alawite or otherwise, we are neighbors and we'll work together. I don't know how much of an anomaly that is, but I experienced it directly last week. And then the final example that I think of is the people that I was with were largely Coptic Christians and Orthodox Christians who had dedicated the last 3 years of their lives to helping people who found themselves stuck in the rubble of this war to rebuild, to find safe haven, and to be provided for. Those would be examples of your question, and the answer is yes. Religious freedom would contribute to a decrease in the suffering of these people.
Doctor, if I might, on this question of the refugee camps specifically, let me just give you the experience of the Christians of Iraq. As most of you probably know, the Christians from the north who were driven out by ISIS mostly took refuge in Kurdish-controlled territories, largely Erbil. And those anywhere else in the country typically took refuge in Syria, or not in Syria, but in Lebanon, in some cases in Jordan. In both of those cases, the Christians deliberately chose not to enter, not to settle in the large UN-sponsored refugee camps, largely because they feared that those camps might have been compromised by the same jihadist forces who had driven them from their homes in the first place. So they instead turned entirely to the church. In Erbil, seriously, I mean, for a couple of years, 2014, most of 2013, it was like Dunkirk. You know, you would walk. They had these big, metal shipping containers that had been deployed under the grounds of shrines and basilicas and convents and seminaries, and people would take shelter there, waiting for a more permanent solution. The church, with the assistance of international groups such as the Knights of Columbus, Aid to the Church in Need, the Catholic Near East Welfare Association, the Catholic Relief Services, the local church there was the only form of support. They were the only firebreak between these people and starvation, death because they couldn't get their medications, complete lack of schooling for their children, and so forth and so on. And to add, to make this more complicated, the public support, and what makes the announcement that was made at the ministerial this week so potentially promising, is that public support for refugees in Iraq and Syria, which is administered through either states or intergovernmental organizations, is almost entirely distributed through those large camps, which has meant that the Christian displaced persons, the Christian refugees, basically speaking, have never gotten any of it. For instance, to this day, there has never been a dime of U.S. public funding directly allocated to be administered by church organizations on the ground in Iraq who are the primary, in fact, the exclusive caregivers for these people, which is what makes this public-private partnership that we're now talking about so potentially important. It's what makes efforts to, in the pledges of Vice President Pence and others, that some share of U.S. funding for genocide relief in Iraq and Syria will be allocated for administration directly by church actors and other minority-led organizations there. Because if we are relying on the major international organizations to take care of these people, experience to date would suggest it simply is not going to happen.
Thank you. Christina, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you. Yes, I find the situation in Iraq to be particularly heartbreaking. I was also just there in Erbil, but I also see a lot of hope. And that is that the Christians who are there, again, at 200,000, many of them do want to stay and are starting to rebuild themselves. The telescope, for instance, and I'm sure you were there as well, met with Valder Salar, an incredible man. It has received direct assistance, $2.2 million from the Hungarian government. About 1,200 homes have been rebuilt, so 1,200 families have moved back in. And yes, I have no doubt, I mean, the vice president himself has admitted that the fact that no USAID assistance has reached Christians in the region is something that needs to be addressed and needs to be fixed. But not everything can be fixed by government entities. Samaritan's Purse, for instance, has a very active charity in Iraq where they are assisting all of the minority religious groups in the area. They're helping the Yazidis, for instance, start sheep. I forget the name in English, like shepherding. Well, they're giving them sheep and doing things and helping them develop a new grassroots economy. And what they did, Samaritan's Purse, and again, it makes me very hopeful. What they did is they made sure that the Yazidi families are helping each other in community. So they are not in competition for this business, but they're helping each other. The situation of the refugee camps in many other parts of the world, sadly, there are a lot of issues for women in these camps. There are a lot of issues for children. There are a lot of issues for abuse. Some of these camps were set up to be functioning for 3 or 4 months. Some of them have been in existence for 7 or 8 years. Without a doubt, there are problems there. But I think in countries that have weak legal infrastructures and there is no rule of law, the refugee camps are exacerbating the already existing in-country sectarian issue. So it's a microcosm of what would happen anyway.
I was wondering whether I could turn the conversation in a slightly different direction and to look into the way religion is often instrumentalized in the context of military conflicts, and it's used to legitimize a particular position, justification of a particular form of hostilities, justification of a particular reshaping of societies, and also to look into the ways we could bring religious freedom discourse to really depart from these approaches. I can see that it is inevitable that in every military conflict we have to deal with the strange paradox that despite of hostilities, despite of the atrocities, the war crimes, the rapes, in the end, the hostilities and the atrocities of the few sooner or later lead to the shaping of culture, shaping of societies, shaping of social structures, and this could be done in 2 ways. If religion is instrumentalized and seen as a bastion of culture, as a safe haven to particular intellectual cultural paradigm, then there is very little space for any alternative paradigms. Alternatively, if this process of reconsolidation after a war zone, after war conflict, is seen as multi-centered political perfectionism, then there is more chances for different voices and different conversations to take place and reshape the society after a particular conflict. So I was wondering whether we could have a little conversation in this direction. How do we deal with this, with the fact that religion is increasingly being instrumentalized to legitimize departure from human rights instruments, justification of atrocities many of us thought have gone with the Second World War and maybe the wars in Yugoslavia?
Well, I mean, there is no doubt that religion often serves as a very convenient pretext for political dynamics in one direction or another. I mean, if we look at many of the populist movements that I think, many analysts would see as one of the most important political phenomena on the global stage today, Erdogan in Turkey, no doubt, plays the Islamic card when it is convenient. Modi in India came to power, basically breaking a decade's, it was very clever actually, it was cynically exploitative, but clever too. The Congress Party seemed to have a stranglehold on power in India for a long time, and then, Modi and the forces behind him and the BJP realized that the only way to beat them was to appeal to the traditionalist, nationalist, sort of hardcore Hindu sentiment of the country, and they put together both a social movement and a political coalition that has ridden that to power. Today, most analysts would say that the most important long-term political trend in India is what they call saffronization. That is the sort of accelerated Hinduization of society and making non-Hindu religious alternatives therefore feel uncomfortable. In Europe, you can look at Hungary, Poland, both now ruled by governments that have strongly appealed and successfully appealed to traditional nationalist sentiments linked to religious identity. And so there is no doubt that politicians always will try to take advantage of pre-existing religious tensions to support agenda, whatever their perceived agenda may be. Very little that civil society and religious players can do to prevent that, except, I guess, not go along with it. But I think the more interesting question, and I will come back to this, is to what extent can religion serve not as a further corrosive, but as a corrective to some of these trends that you're talking about? I look at in Mali, in Africa, against all odds, this Saturday, Malians are going to head to the polls to try to elect a new president, despite the fact that there is a significant threat of a jihadist takeover of their country any time now. But nevertheless, in a spirit of defiance, they're going to try to keep their democratic institutions alive. Caritas, which is the Global Federation of Catholic Charities, the branch of Caritas in Mali, is going to be deploying 513 election observers. They are the only player in civil society that has been sanctioned by all political forces as trustworthy to ensure the validity of the election, that is, to ensure that it is free and fair. And of course, they're doing that motivated by religious beliefs. So I think it is easy to point to situations in the world where religion has served as the kind of spark that has lit a conflict, and when it continues to fuel it, because it is a very potent fuel for people who have vested interest in conflict. But You know, my theology 101 professor in college told me that just as there is a mystery of evil, there is also a mystery of good. You know, sometimes it is hard to explain situations such as Mali when people who have every reason to believe that this is a futile exercise nevertheless are so profoundly motivated by their convictions that they are willing to put their expertise and in some cases even their lives on the line in a kind of chaotic effort to hold the forces of darkness at bay. So I think we need to focus on that as well.
Yeah. Christina?
Yeah. The great sociologist Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree About Religion and Politics, talks about whether is religion part of the problem or part of the solution, and how do you, both, yes, and how do you break out of cycles. And in his book he says, religion binds and blinds, and no amount of truth or fact end up persuading a person who has taken on religion as their primary mode of understanding. Now, is that good or bad? So if I'm a Christian and I think that I should die for my fellow man, no amount of someone telling me is like, that's a bad idea, will persuade me otherwise, right? But in a situation like Mali, and I'm very interested in Mali, I'm glad you brought it up. I'll give you an example. Mali is actually a pretty pluralistic society. There are a number of religions. And a group studying out of the United Kingdom, studying female genital mutilation, went to Mali to understand why women from several different religions were still having their girls undergo FGM. So they put a training program together to say this is not religiously based, it's not healthy, there are all these risks. And in the end, the women would not change their minds. And in fact, many of the women said, I don't like the idea of doing this to my daughter. However, I just cannot justify not doing it. She will not get married. There were all these fears associated with it. No amount of reason, no amount of facts played into it, even when the scientific truth was explained. So what Jonathan Haidt concludes is that in order to persuade someone else, we have to be part of their tribe for a moment and really understand what their motivations are. And as a final point, freedom of religion or belief does not protect religion. What it protects is the people's ability to decide what they believe and to act accordingly. And regrettably, a lot of people hear religious freedom or freedom of religion belief, and they immediately think of the religion they like the least. I cannot tell you how many people in this field I've asked, do you believe in religious freedom? Yes, absolutely, except for the Mormons, or except for the Muslims, or except... So freedom of religion, I believe, has to do with protecting individuals, not asserting that one religion is better than the other, and not protecting religion, just the individual. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could now steer the conversation in another direction, and it is particularly the direction which tries to look into the ways we could make freedom of religion or belief a more credible narrative to deal with some of the conflicts, with some of the tensions we have flagged. For many years, at the policy level, freedom of religion or belief was seen as a rather awkward right for policymakers to engage with, and it was often seen as being important simply because religion makes people burn each other's houses, and therefore we need to understand and engage with freedom of religion or belief more as a way to contain conflict and the damage. Only recently we have started looking into good practices in more positive dimensions of freedom of religion or belief in terms of building social cohesion, building plural societies, building multiple dialogical spaces in a social context. But this hasn't yet made much changes as seeing freedom of religion and belief as a problem-fixing or problem-solving issue. And I was just wondering, from your work, whether you see a way forward, how to see freedom of religion and belief as a much more dynamic way of opening up strategies of building vibrant, dynamic, diverse society and cultures, and just going beyond this level of treating it as something which is there to fix a problem rather than create a vision, more long-term vision. Thoughts?
Sure. Last year, our team spent 9 months working with an armored division in the Nineveh Desert, where we have all been. And our job was to work at a casualty collection point, helping civilians. As ISIS was routed out, civilians would climb out of the rubble, and our team was there to help them with basic supplies, medical, and get them to a place of safety. One of the disturbing features of our work over those 9 months was that a lot of the soldiers who were Shiites were going into these Sunni civilian homes and just destroying them, just shooting their rifles at anything glass or anything breakable, and then stealing everything they could potentially sell or felt that they wanted. And our team tried to help them see that that's not going to help this war ever end. And it boils back down to my closing. And again, as naive as it sounds, well, it boils back down to the universal imperative or the golden rule, doing for these people what we would want done for us or to our own people. And we tried to reason with the Hashishabi militia, who was then fighting with the Iraqi army, and they wouldn't hear us at that time, but we did win some friends over to that, and somehow I believe that's the answer. If we can consider ourselves in their shoes and work towards a kind of reconciliation, and even with these soldiers at war to do their work with a level of dignity and not act as mobsters or terrorists themselves.
Yeah. Christina and John?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm thinking about the Nineveh Plains too, because it wouldn't be great if we could find a solution. But I agree with you wholeheartedly. Relational experiences, interfaith experiences, putting yourself as a member of the tribe you're talking to is vital. And that's why religious freedom has to be robust, right? Because once a country decides that one religion is more legitimate or important or justifiable than the other, then naturally we have these sectarian issues. I was also thinking about in the United States after 9/11, a lot of Sikhs who had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11 were attacked because 72% of Americans thought that anyone with a turban or a beard were Muslim, right? So the Sikh community has worked really hard in engaging and collaborating with other religious groups to raise awareness in the United States. So if we were able to do the same in a place like Iraq and have Sunni and Shia finally talk to each other and develop common bonds, that would be great. Unfortunately, in Iraq, the Iranian government has made sure that certain militias are incredibly well-funded, and they're buying Christians out of their homes, and they're changing the demographics. So there's a lot of resentment. So, in conclusion, again, you're right that freedom of religion or belief has been treated as the eccentric uncle of the human rights family. It doesn't help that we have a lot of our friends calling it a Western value, when in fact it isn't. It wasn't drafted as one. So in order to have a better understanding of that vital core right as essential to the promotion of the rest of the rights, I think we're going to have to do a bit more work in all the international fora.
Well, I agree with the instinct here, which is that there is a massive sales pitch that has to be made upon behalf of religious freedom on the global level and at the cultural grassroots, not just in the arenas of the academy and so on. But, you know, where ordinary people draw conclusions about where they want to go with their lives. The specific form of violation of religious freedom that I have focused on as a journalist is anti-Christian persecution. And I have long been stunned about the relative wall of silence in Western discussion, even within the confines of Western religious organizations, Christian churches in this country. The relative ignorance about the scale of the situation internationally, lack of awareness and so on. I don't really know how to explain that. All I can say is that it is completely unjustified in the same way that you didn't have to be Jewish in the 1960s to be concerned about dissident Jews in the Soviet Union. And you didn't have to be black in the 1980s to be concerned about victims of apartheid in South Africa. You clearly do not have to be Christian today to be concerned about any human rights scourge that, according to the most sort of reliable estimate, puts 200 million people every day at risk of physical harassment, arrest, torture, imprisonment, and ultimately death. Simply for the mere fact of being a Christian, a human rights scourge that claims somewhere between one life every 5 minutes and one life every hour. Obviously ought to galvanize our attention regardless of what your religious conviction happens to be. That silence has to be broken. How do we do it? Well, I fundamentally agree that the key here is the human drama. I think, you know, policy studies and surveys, these are all essential resources in trying to make this case. But ultimately, you know, what brought people around about Soviet Jews in the 60s? It was really reading Solzhenitsyn. Coming into contact with someone who had experienced that in his own bones. You know, in the 70s and 80s, you know, what put apartheid front and center of our consciousness was coming to know Nelson Mandela, the story of Mandela. It was seeing a movie about Stephen Biko, and on, right? I think what we need right now, quite honestly, is that we need the Schindler's List of persecutions of religious freedom in the early 21st century. We need that slam dunk, heartbreaking, mesmerizing movie about Asia Bibi in Pakistan, or the Rohingya in Myanmar, or whoever it is. You know, the victims of Kandhamal in India. I mean, I think ultimately it is personal narrative that reframes consciousness and ultimately drives history. And we're going to, in our journalistic piece of the patch, we are going to continue trying to tell those human stories that hopefully will serve as the raw material and stimulate the imagination of the most gifted storytellers of our time, because I think that's what this is going to take.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion, but as it always happens, good things do have to come to an end. So, and on this note, I would like to close this session, thank our speakers for their fascinating contribution.